A 7-year-old girl tugged her father's sleeve, pointing at the terrified woman surrounded by 5 armed men in a crowded cafe. "Daddy, please help her." Those 5 words ended a quiet retirement, unleashed a lethal Navy SEAL, and brought a 4-star Marine general crashing down on a billion-dollar conspiracy. The rain in Seattle always had a way of washing the color out of the world, leaving behind a cold gray canvas. For David Cross, that was exactly how he preferred it. Sitting in a corner booth at the Artisan Bean on 4th Avenue, he nursed a black coffee and watched the droplets race down the thick glass. Across the table, his 7-year-old daughter Lily was deeply engrossed in a coloring book, her brow furrowed in fierce concentration as she applied a vibrant purple crayon to a cartoon dragon. David was a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite and left in the wind. At 6'2", with broad shoulders and a quiet, still demeanor, he possessed a physical presence that naturally demanded space. But his eyes, a striking pale blue, were tired. 2 years ago, he had traded his trident and his life in SEAL Team 6 for civilian clothes. The loss of his wife Claire to a sudden aneurysm had shattered his world, leaving him as the sole anchor for Lily. He walked away from Tier 1 operations without a backward glance. The world could burn as long as the fire didn't reach his daughter. At 10:14 a.m., the brass bell above the cafe door violently chimed. A woman practically threw herself inside, the heavy glass door slamming shut behind her. She was drenched, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Even disheveled, Victoria Hastings commanded the room. As the 32-year-old CEO of Ethelgard Technologies, a pioneer in next-generation aerospace biometrics, she was a regular fixture on the covers of Forbes and the Wall Street Journal. Usually, she was flanked by an army of corporate lawyers and executive protection details. Today, she was alone, wearing a torn trench coat over a ruined silk blouse, clutching a sleek titanium hard drive to her chest as if it were a beating heart. David noticed her immediately. His threat assessment radar, honed over dozens of deployments in the darkest corners of the globe, spiked. He watched as Victoria darted toward the back of the cafe, her eyes darting wildly toward the street. She slid into a booth, 2 tables away from David and Lily, attempting to make herself as small as possible. She pulled out a cracked smartphone, her fingers trembling so violently she could barely unlock the screen. 30 seconds later, the bell chimed again. 5 men walked in. They didn't belong in a high-end coffee shop on a Tuesday morning. They moved with a predatory, coordinated grace, spreading out the moment they crossed the threshold. They wore expensive, dark, casual wear, but David's trained eyes caught the telltale signs, the slight bulge of concealed firearms at their hips, the rigid posture of military or high-end private military contractors, and the clear silicone earpieces curled behind their ears. The leader, a broad-chested man with a scarred jawline and dead, shark-like eyes, locked onto Victoria. He gestured sharply with 2 fingers. The other 4 men moved to secure the exits and block the sightlines from the street. The cafe was half empty, the few patrons mostly college students with headphones, oblivious to the rising tension. The barista was in the back room. The leader approached Victoria's booth. David subtly shifted his weight, sliding his left foot out from under the table, positioning himself for sudden movement. "Miss Hastings," the leader said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that carried over the soft jazz playing on the cafe speakers. "You've made this much harder than it needed to be. The board is very disappointed." Victoria pressed her back against the leather seat, clutching the hard drive. "If you kill me, the dead man switch activates. The source code goes public, and Vanguard Holdings loses everything. Tell Richard I'm not playing his game." "Mr. Sterling doesn't negotiate with dead women," the man replied coldly. He reached into his coat. "The drive. Now. We can walk out the back door, or we can make a mess in front of all these nice people. Your choice, Victoria." David's muscles coiled. He recognized the name Vanguard Holdings, a ruthless corporate giant with deep ties to defense contracting, and the name Sterling meant power. This wasn't a mugging, this was a corporate hit. He looked down at his daughter. He had sworn an oath to himself to never bring violence into her world. He reached across the table, gently placing his hand over Lily's. "Hey, sweetie," he whispered, his voice calm and steady. "I need you to slide under the table for a second. We're going to play hide and seek." But Lily didn't move. Her large green eyes were fixed on the booth 2 tables over. She had seen the panic in Victoria's face. She had seen the cruel, looming posture of the men surrounding her. Lily looked up at David, her voice trembling but clear. "Daddy, please help her." David froze. He looked at his daughter, seeing the innocent, absolute trust in her eyes. She didn't understand the tactical disadvantage, the legal nightmare, or the deadly nature of the men in the room. She just saw someone who was scared, and she knew her dad was a protector. A cold, familiar calm washed over David. The tired father vanished. The seal returned. "Under the table, Lily," David said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Cover your ears. Do not come out until I say your name." Lily scrambled under the heavy oak table. David stood up. "Excuse me." David's voice cut through the cafe, smooth and authoritative. The leader of the extraction team paused, his hand still inside his jacket. He turned slowly, his eyes raking over David's faded jeans, simple flannel shirt, and scruffy beard. He saw a civilian. "Take a seat, buddy," the leader sneered. "This is a private conversation." 2 of the flankers, tall men with Eastern European features, took a step toward David, trying to intimidate him back into his booth. "She looks like she's done talking," David said, stepping out into the aisle. He kept his hands open and raised to chest level, a placating gesture that also positioned them perfectly to strike. "Why don't you boys step outside? Let the lady enjoy her coffee." "Handle him," the leader snapped, turning his attention back to Victoria and reaching to grab her arm. It happened faster than the human eye could process. The first flanker reached out to shove David backward. David didn't retreat. He stepped into the man's personal space, slipping inside his guard. David's left hand parried the man's arm, while his right hand delivered a devastating, open palm strike to the man's chin. The crack of bone echoed like a gunshot. The man's eyes rolled back, and he collapsed instantly, his brain violently rattled against his skull. The second flanker barely had time to widen his eyes before David pivoted. Using the momentum from the first strike, David swept his right leg, kicking the second man's knee inward with a sickening crunch. As the man howled and dropped in height, David drove a merciless elbow into the base of his neck. 2 down. Total elapsed time, 3 seconds. The cafe erupted into chaos. The students shrieked and scrambled toward the front door. The leader released Victoria, spinning around and drawing a suppressed 9mm pistol from his jacket. "You dead son of a..." David didn't wait for him to finish. He grabbed a heavy ceramic coffee mug from the nearest table and hurled it like a fastball. It smashed directly into the leader's face, shattering on impact and blinding him with scalding coffee and porcelain shrapnel. The man staggered backward, firing a wild, suppressed shot that shattered the pastry display case. Before the leader could recover, David closed the distance. He grabbed the man's gun hand, twisting it sharply outward in a brutal wrist lock. The pistol clattered to the floor. David stepped behind him, wrapping his arm around the man's throat in a textbook rear-naked choke. He applied crushing pressure, cutting off the blood flow to the brain. In 4 seconds, the leader went limp. David let him drop to the linoleum. The remaining 2 men, stationed by the door, realized this was no civilian. They drew their weapons, their professionalism overriding their shock. "Drop him!" one yelled, lining up a shot. David dove behind the heavy wooden counter, just as 2 silenced rounds thudded into the oak where his chest had been a millisecond before. He was unarmed, pinned, and outgunned, but he was in his element. "Daddy!" Lily's panicked voice drifted from under the booth. The sound of his daughter's fear flipped a switch deep inside David's psyche. The calculated operator was gone. Pure predatory aggression took over. David grabbed a heavy, stainless steel steaming pitcher from the barista station. He waited for the rhythm of the men's footsteps as they advanced on his position. 1, 2, 3. They were splitting up to flank the counter. David exploded from cover on the left side. The man closest to him fired, the bullet tearing through the sleeve of David's flannel shirt, grazing his bicep. David ignored the burn. He hurled the heavy steel pitcher directly at the man's face, forcing him to flinch. In that microsecond, David closed the gap, trapping the man's gun arm against his body and driving 3 rapid, piston-like punches into his floating ribs. As the man gasped, David disarmed him, stripped the weapon, and slammed the butt of the pistol into the man's temple. The final man came around the right side of the counter, aiming his weapon. David didn't hesitate. He brought up the stolen gun and fired twice. Center axis relock, 2 shots, center mass. The final mercenary dropped hard, his weapon sliding across the floor. Silence descended on the cafe, save for the hiss of the espresso machine and the pouring rain outside. David stood amidst the wreckage, his breathing barely elevated. He quickly swept the room with his eyes, ensuring all 5 threats were neutralized. None of them were moving. He dropped the magazine from the pistol, ejected the chambered round, and placed the empty weapon on the counter. He immediately turned to the booth. Lily, a small, trembling face peeked out from under the tablecloth. David rushed over, dropping to his knees and pulling her into a tight embrace. "I've got you. It's over. I've got you," he murmured, burying his face in her hair. Slowly, Victoria Hastings rose from her booth. She was staring at David with a mixture of absolute terror and profound awe. She looked at the 5 heavily armed elite corporate fixers groaning or unconscious on the floor, and then at the bearded father comforting his little girl. Who are you?" Victoria whispered, her voice shaking. David stood up, keeping Lily tucked behind his leg. "I'm just a guy trying to get coffee with his kid." He looked at the wreckage. "You need to call the police." One of the men on the floor, the leader, whose face was a bruised, bloody mess from the coffee mug, let out a wet, rattling laugh. He rolled onto his side, spitting blood onto the tile. "The police?" the leader wheezed, a grim smile cracking his face. "Who do you think dispatched us? You have no idea what you just did, hero. You just declared war on Vanguard Holdings. You're dead. The girl is dead. It's just a matter of hours." David's pale blue eyes locked onto the man on the floor. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Victoria rushed forward, grabbing David's arm. "He's right. They own the local precinct. If we stay here, we'll be arrested, and we won't survive the night in holding. Please, my car is out back. I can explain everything, but we have to leave now." In the distance, the wail of police sirens began to echo through the rainy Seattle streets. They were approaching entirely too fast. The response time was unnatural. David looked at Victoria, then down at Lily. His quiet life was over. He scooped his daughter up into his arms, grabbing Victoria's elbow with his free hand. "Show the way," David said. As they ran out the back exit into the rain-slicked alleyway, David knew he had just stepped into a war zone. What he didn't know was that the hard drive in Victoria's pocket contained secrets that reached all the way to the Pentagon. And the man hunting them wasn't just a corporate CEO, he was tied to the only man David Cross had ever truly feared in his military career, General Arthur C. Sterling. The rain fell in sheets as they burst into the alley behind the Artisan Bean. The wail of Seattle Police Department cruisers was deafeningly close, tires screeching on the wet asphalt of 4th Avenue. "There!" Victoria pointed to a matte black Mercedes-Benz G-Class AMG parked haphazardly near the dumpsters. "It's B6, level armored. Get in." David threw open the heavy, reinforced rear door, securely buckling Lily into the leather seat before sliding into the driver's side. Victoria jumped into the passenger seat, tossing him the heavy encrypted key fob. The V8 engine roared to life with a deep, guttural growl. As a black and white SPD cruiser violently turned into the alley, its spotlight blindingly bright, David didn't hesitate. He slammed the G-Wagon into drive, gunning the engine. Instead of fleeing, he drove the 3-ton armored SUV directly at the cruiser. The police driver panicked, swerving hard to the right and crashing into a brick wall. David blew past them, ripping the steering wheel hard to the left and tearing onto a narrow side street. For 20 minutes, David executed a masterclass in counter-surveillance driving. He utilized blind spots, abruptly crossed 3 lanes of traffic on I-5 North, and took 3 consecutive right turns in the industrial district to ensure they had no tail. "Daddy," Lily's small voice piped up from the back seat, her hands clutching her knees. "Are we playing hide-and-seek for real now?" David caught her eyes in the rearview mirror. The cold, lethal operator melted away, replaced by the fiercely loving father. "Yes, Bug, we are. And you know I'm the hide-and-seek champion of the world. Nobody is going to find us. I promise." He glanced at Victoria. She was gripping the door handle, her knuckles white, but her breathing had steadied. The panic was receding, replaced by the cold, calculating intelligence that had made her a self-made billionaire at 32. "Talk," David commanded, his voice low and hard. "I just put my daughter in the crosshairs of a Tier 1 PMC strike team. You owe me an explanation, Miss Hastings." Victoria swallowed hard, pulling the titanium hard drive from her coat. "My company, Ethelgard Technologies, just finalized Project Aegis. It's a neural link biometric system designed to keep fighter pilots conscious during extreme G-force maneuvers. It reads brainwaves and predicts biological failure before it happens, adjusting the aircraft's avionics to compensate." David kept his eyes on the road. Sounds like something DARPA would pay billions for. Why are hitmen shooting up a coffee shop over it? "Because Project Aegis can be reverse-engineered," Victoria said, her voice dripping with venom. "If you tweak the algorithm, it doesn't just read neural pathways, it can override them. In the wrong hands, it's the ultimate targeting software for autonomous drone swarms. No human empathy, no hesitation, just algorithmic slaughter." David's grip on the steering wheel tightened, and Vanguard Holdings wants it. Richard Sterling, Vanguard's CEO, initiated a hostile takeover last month, Victoria explained. "I blocked it. Yesterday, my chief security officer found a ghost file in our mainframe. Vanguard wasn't just trying to buy us. They had already brokered a black market deal to sell the weaponized Aegis code to a sanctioned foreign state for $80 billion. They just needed my master encryption key to unlock the final protocol." "You're a civilian," David said. "Vanguard wouldn't risk a daylight assassination on a high-profile CEO unless they had top cover. They need someone high up in the food chain to scrub the investigation and stall the feds." Victoria looked at him, her eyes wide. "How do you know that?" "Because I used to work for the people who do the scrubbing," David replied grimly. "Who is Sterling's Pentagon connection?" "His uncle," Victoria whispered. "A 4-star, General Arthur C. Sterling." The name hit David like a physical blow. The interior of the car seemed to shrink. General Arthur Sterling wasn't just brass. He was the shadowy architect of half a dozen off-the-books JSOC operations. He was a man who viewed collateral damage as a line item on a budget spreadsheet. During David's final deployment in Kandahar, it was a piece of bad intel signed off by Sterling that had led his SEAL team into a devastating ambush. "If Arthur Sterling is involved, the local cops are already compromised," David said, his mind racing through tactical scenarios. "The FBI won't touch it until the check clears. We are completely off the grid." "Where are we going?" Victoria asked. "Everett," David replied, taking an off-ramp toward the grimy, rain-swept shipyards. "I have a friend who owes me his life. He runs a logistics company. It's a ghost facility. We go to ground, secure Lily, and figure out how to upload that drive to the one place Sterling can't scrub." "Where?" "The global press," David said. "We're going to burn his empire to the ground." The Everett shipyard was a graveyard of rusted shipping containers and towering, dormant cranes. David drove the G-Wagon into a massive, dilapidated warehouse labeled Pacific Rim Freight. As the heavy steel doors rolled shut behind them, the darkness was pierced by the harsh glare of industrial halogen lights. A man stepped out from a glass-enclosed office. He was missing his left arm below the elbow, sporting a sleek, carbon fiber prosthetic. This was Hutch, a former 160th SOAR Night Stalker pilot who had flown David out of more hot zones than he could count. "Cross," Hutch said, tossing a heavy ring of keys onto a workbench. "When you called on the burner, you said you needed the vault. You didn't say you were bringing the CEO of Ethelgard and a kid." "Things got complicated, Hutch," David said, unbuckling Lily and carrying her out of the car. "We need offline servers, heavy comms, and whatever you have in the armory." Hutch whistled low, eyeing Victoria. "Vanguard Holdings put a $10 million bounty on your head on the dark web about 20 minutes ago, lady. The entire underworld of the Pacific Northwest is looking for you." "Then we need to move fast," Victoria said, her corporate command voice returning. "Mr. Hutchinson, I need access to a hardened terminal with a direct satellite uplink. If I can bypass the local ISP nodes, I can dump the Aegis files directly onto the servers of 5 major news networks simultaneously. Once it's in the wild, Vanguard's stock plummets, and the Pentagon will be forced to launch a public inquiry." Hutch nodded, tapping a code into a heavy steel door that led into a retrofitted shipping container inside the warehouse. "Server room is in there, air-gapped. Have at it." David knelt down in front of Lily. He pulled a small silver compass from his pocket, a trinket he had carried since his BUD-S training, and pressed it into her hand. "Lily, listen to me," David said, his voice a soothing rumble. "Hutch is going to take you to a special room beneath the floorboards. It's safe. It's quiet. I need you to stay there and watch this compass. As long as the needle points north, you know Daddy is right up above you, keeping you safe. Understand?" Lily's lower lip quivered, but she nodded bravely, her tiny fingers closing around the cold metal. "I love you, Daddy." "I love you more, Bug." He kissed her forehead. Hutch gently led the girl toward the hidden floor hatch. David turned to the secondary shipping container, the armory. He walked in, the familiar smell of gun oil and cordite washing over him. The civilian dad disappeared completely. He stripped off his blood-stained flannel shirt. He pulled on a lightweight Kevlar plate carrier, adjusting the straps with practiced precision. He selected a Sig Sauer MCX Rattler, a compact assault rifle chambered in, 300 blackout, perfectly suited for close-quarters warehouse fighting. He slammed a 30-round magazine into the well, racked the charging handle, and loaded 4 extra magazines into his chest rig. He slid a Glock 19 into his drop-leg holster and grabbed 3 M84 stun grenades. "Cross!" Hutch yelled from the server room door, his face pale. "We have a problem. The perimeter sensors just tripped. Heat signatures. At least 12 bodies, moving in stack formation. They didn't drive. They halo jumped, or came in via silent zodiacs from the water. They are professional." David's eyes narrowed. Vanguard had tracked the armored car via satellite thermal imaging. "Victoria, how long on the upload?" David shouted into the server room. "The encryption is heavy," she yelled back, her fingers flying across the keyboard in a blur. 7 minutes. I need 7 minutes." "You have 5, David said, racking the bolt of his rifle. "Hutch, get in the hole with Lily. Lock it from the inside." "I'm not leaving you to fight a dozen pipe hitters alone," Hutch protested, raising a customized shotgun with his prosthetic arm. "You are, because if I fall, you're the last thing standing between them and my daughter," David ordered. "Get in the damn hole, Hutch." Hutch hesitated, then nodded grimly, disappearing into the floor and sealing the heavy vault door shut. David was alone. The power to the warehouse suddenly cut out, plunged into pitch darkness. The only light was the faint, rhythmic glow of Victoria's computer monitor inside the server container. Rain hammered against the corrugated steel roof, masking the sound of footsteps. David slipped a pair of panoramic night vision goggles, PNVGs, down over his eyes. The world shifted into a crisp, glowing green. Crack boom. The eastern loading doors blew inward in a shower of sparks and twisted metal, breaching charges. Silhouettes poured into the warehouse, moving with lethal, terrifying efficiency. They were wearing advanced tactical gear, spreading out behind forklifts and shipping crates. Lasers danced through the dust and smoke, scanning for targets. David didn't wait for them to set their perimeter. He initiated the ambush. He leaned out from the second-story catwalk, centering his holographic sight on the lead point man. Pop, pop. 2 suppressed rounds dropped the man instantly. "Contact front. Catwalk, left side." A mercenary barked, his voice distorted by a tactical radio. The warehouse erupted in a deafening crescendo of automatic gunfire. Tracers zipped through the air, shattering glass and punching holes into the metal catwalk. David sprinted, sliding behind a massive steel generator as bullets sparked and whined off the machinery inches from his head. He pulled an M84 flashbang, pulled the pin, cooked it for 1 second, and banked it hard off the warehouse wall into the center of the kill zone. The grenade detonated with a blinding flash and a concussive roar. In the ensuing chaos, David vaulted over the railing, dropping 15 feet to the ground floor. He rolled, absorbing the impact, and came up firing. He dropped 2 blinded mercenaries with surgical precision before sliding behind a stack of wooden pallets. 3 down, 9 to go. "Flush him out!" a voice roared. Heavy suppression fire ripped through the pallets. An M249 saw light machine gun tore the wood to splinters, forcing David to stay low, pinned against the concrete floor. He checked his magazine. Half empty. He was outgunned and outmaneuvered. 3 minutes! Victoria screamed from the server room, the sound of bullets pinging off the heavy steel walls of her container. A mercenary flanked David's right side, raising a shotgun. David rolled onto his back, kicking the mercenary's kneecap out and firing a single round into his chest plate, followed by a transition to the head. But the delay cost him. The saw gunner stepped out from behind a forklift, the massive barrel pointed directly at David's chest. There was no cover left, no time to raise his rifle. Suddenly, the warehouse shook. It wasn't a breaching charge, it was a localized earthquake. The heavy, rhythmic thud-thud-thud of massive rotor blades violently vibrated the corrugated walls. Dust fell like snow from the rafters. The deafening roar of aviation engines drowned out the gunfire. The saw gunner hesitated, looking up at the roof in confusion. Outside, a booming, mechanically amplified voice cut through the storm, echoing with the authority of a god. "This is a United States Marine Corps forbidden zone. Drop your weapons and lie flat on the ground, or you will be eradicated by heavy cannon fire." The vanguard mercenaries froze. The main cargo doors of the warehouse were suddenly violently ripped clean off their hinges by the winch of a hovering, heavily armed MV-22 Osprey. The rain and wind howled into the building, revealing 3 more Ospreys hovering in the sky behind it. Dozens of elite Marine Force recon operators flooded into the warehouse, their weapons raised, flooding the space with blinding tactical lights. Walking calmly through the chaos, untouched by the rain and indifferent to the weapons pointed in every direction, was a man in a crisp, flawlessly pressed Marine Corps dress uniform, covered in ribbons. The cavalry hadn't just arrived. The wrath of God had. The deafening roar of the MV-22 Ospreys swallowed all other sound in the warehouse. Dust, rainwater, and debris swirled in a chaotic vortex as 30 heavily armed Marine Force recon operators fast-roped from the hovering aircraft. They hit the concrete floor with practiced lethal precision, their M27 infantry automatic rifles locked onto the remaining vanguard mercenaries. The laser sights from the Marines' rifles painted the chests and heads of the surviving corporate hitmen in a grid of inescapable red dots. The vanguard saw gunner, who had David dead to rights just seconds before, slowly lowered his weapon to the ground, his face pale beneath his tactical helmet. He knew the difference between a high-paid private contractor and the premier expeditionary strike force of the United States military. To fire a single shot now would mean immediate, overwhelming annihilation. "Weapons free. Step away from the hardware and interlock your fingers behind your heads," barked a Marine captain, his voice cutting through the dying whine of the Osprey engines as they adjusted their hover. The mercenaries complied, dropping their specialized rifles and dropping to their knees on the wet concrete. Through the corridor of heavily armed Marines walked a man who seemed entirely out of place in the grimy, blood-stained warehouse, yet commanded the space with absolute authority. He wore the sharply tailored dress blues of the United States Marine Corps, 4 silver stars gleaming on his shoulders, and a chest full of ribbons that told a story of 40 years of uninterrupted warfare. This was not General Arthur Sterling. This was General Thomas Hackett, the sitting commandant of the Marine Corps, and a man whose reputation for uncompromising integrity terrified Washington politicians and Pentagon bureaucrats alike. The Vanguard strike team leader, bleeding heavily from a gunshot wound to his shoulder, staggered to his feet, trying to salvage the situation. "General, you are interfering with a sanctioned Black Book retrieval operation. We have top cover from the Pentagon. General Arthur Sterling authorized." "Shut your mouth!" General Hackett interrupted, his voice a low, rumbling growl that didn't require a megaphone to be felt in the marrow of the men's bones. He didn't even look at the mercenary, walking straight past him. "Arthur Sterling doesn't authorize anything anymore. As of 20 minutes ago, military police raided his estate in Virginia. He's currently sitting in a holding cell at Quantico, awaiting a tribunal for high treason." The mercenary's jaw went slack. The invincible corporate shield of Vanguard Holdings had just been shattered. Hackett stopped in the middle of the warehouse, his sharp eyes scanning the wreckage, the bodies of the mercenaries David had neutralized, and finally, the barricade of wooden pallets. "You can come out now, Cross," Hackett called out, the strict military cadence softening just a fraction. "Though I see your idea of a quiet retirement is just as explosive as your active duty years." David slowly stood up from behind the shredded pallets, lowering his Sig Sauer. He slung the rifle over his shoulder, his breath coming in heavy, controlled exhales. He walked out into the open, his Kevlar plate carrier scorched and his flannel shirt soaked in rainwater and blood from the graze on his arm. "General," David said, offering a stiff, exhausted nod. "You're a long way from D.C. How did you know?" "When a Tier 1 PMC associated with Vanguard Holdings starts shooting up a coffee shop in Seattle, red flags go up," Hackett explained, pulling a cigar from his breast pocket but leaving it unlit. "But when my cyber warfare division at Fort Meade detected an unauthorized bypass attempt on a DARPA-level military encryption protocol, we traced the ping. I recognized the digital footprint. Only 2 people in the world use that specific, paranoid routing sequence to hide their tracks. One is a dead Russian hacker. The other is my former JSOC point man." Hackett stepped closer, his eyes raking over David's battered form. "I owed you, David, after what Arthur Sterling's bad intel did to your team in Kandahar. I swore I would never let that bastard's corruption touch you or your family again. When we intercepted the dark web bounty on Victoria Hastings and saw you were in the crossfire, I diverted a training squadron out of Camp Pendleton. We weren't going to let Vanguard bury this." Inside the heavily armored shipping container, a distinct high-pitched chime echoed over the speakers. The heavy steel door swung open, and Victoria Hastings stepped out. She looked exhausted, her hair clinging to her damp face, but her eyes blazed with the triumph of a conqueror. She held up the glowing titanium hard drive. "It's done," Victoria announced, her voice echoing in the sudden quiet of the warehouse. "The upload hit 100%. The Aegis source code is completely locked behind an impenetrable biometric firewall, and all of Vanguard's black market emails, financial ledgers, and offshore routing numbers have just been mass emailed to the Department of Justice, the SEC, and the top editors at Reuters and Bloomberg." She looked directly at the Vanguard mercenaries kneeling on the floor. "By the time the New York Stock Exchange opens tomorrow, Vanguard Holdings will be a penny stock, and Richard Sterling will be hunting for a non-extradition country. Ethelgard Technologies is safe. We already had secure bidding offers from Palantir and Lockheed Martin to develop Aegis defensively. Sterling got greedy, and now he has nothing." General Hackett nodded approvingly. "My Marines will handle the cleanup here, Miss Hastings. The FBI is about 10 minutes behind us, but they're coming to arrest the men on the floor, not you. You've done your country a massive service today." David didn't care about the source code, the stock market, or the treason tribunals. He immediately turned his back on the general and the billionaire CEO, walking toward the trap door, hidden beneath the heavy workbench. He knocked 3 times, a specific, syncopated rhythm. A moment later, the heavy floorboards shifted. Hutch pushed the hatch open with his good arm, climbing out before reaching down into the darkness. He lifted Lily out of the hole. She was covered in dust, clutching the small silver compass tightly against her chest. She looked around at the towering, heavily armed Marines, the flashing tactical lights, and the destroyed warehouse. Then, her wide green eyes found her father. "Daddy!" she cried out. David dropped to his knees, ignoring the searing pain in his grazed arm and his bruised ribs. He caught her as she ran into him, wrapping his arms around her so tightly it was as if he were trying to shield her from the rest of the world forever. He buried his face in her small shoulder, his broad back shaking just once. "I've got you, bug," David whispered fiercely, his voice finally cracking. "I've got you. It's over." Lily pulled back just enough to look at his face. She wiped a smudge of soot from his cheek with her tiny thumb. She opened her hand, revealing the silver compass. "The needle stayed pointing north, Daddy," she said softly, a small, brave smile breaking through her fear. "Just like you said, it pointed right at you." David smiled, a genuine, profound expression of relief that smoothed away the lethal edges of the operator he had been forced to become today. "It always will, Lily, no matter what." Victoria walked over, her corporate armor entirely stripped away. She knelt beside them, looking at David and then at the little girl who had started it all by asking her father to help a stranger. "Thank you," Victoria said, her voice choked with emotion. "You risked everything, both of you. I owe you my life, David." David stood up, lifting Lily into his arms. He looked at the billionaire CEO, then at the 4-star general, orchestrating the arrest of the corporate hitman. "You don't owe me anything, Victoria," David said quietly, turning to walk out of the warehouse into the clearing Seattle night. "Just make sure the world stays safe enough for her to grow up in. That's all the payment I need." Did David's fierce protection of his daughter and his unstoppable SEAL skills give you chills? When a father's love meets elite military training, no corrupt billionaire stands a chance. If you were captivated by this intense story of justice, sacrifice, and the ultimate rescue, hit that like button right now. Share this video with someone who loves a gripping, action-packed thriller. And don't forget to subscribe for more incredible, heart-pounding stories.